Whether you're 12, 24, or 28, you know the joy from a long night of playing with friends. The school bus dropped you off at your stop, and it didn't matter what happened that day, good or bad. You were rushing to get home so you could meet with your friends. As a kid, school is just something to get through before your day truly begins. It feels that this is lost on us as adults. Nonetheless, it rings true that some of the best times you will ever have are likely already behind you. Now, this may upset you, bleakness may overcome you, and you may find yourself cursing at the wind, wondering where the time went. But this is futile and unironically childish. There is no time to waste. Time moves fast, clearly, and if you don't as well, it will not wait for you. We tend to roll through all of the high points, best times, and greatest hits as we reflect on our childhood, and why wouldn't we? There's a reason childhood traumas are usually erased by our brains. We would rather not remember. However, sometimes there are things that we forget that should be remembered, that need to be remembered. And sometimes we fall victim to oppressors as a result. They tell you that you should be yourself, but you also have to sacrifice your desires and sometimes your values in order to make a living. Most of us have dreams that are cast by the wayside because we are made to feel too small to achieve them. They tell you to be yourself, but how can you truly be this way when the bills must be paid, when the cows need feeding, and the kids are screaming? How can you have time for your dreams? How did we have time to play with our friends for hours every day? Like I said earlier, there are many memories worth remembering and others worth forgetting, but the difference between the two is not so easily determined. Some terrible memories are vital to keep in mind. Here's one. It was a quiet night in a small town in an unknown state. This particular town has one street down the middle and is a true testament to the progress of this country. In a place where New York City exists and shines brightly, so brightly it can be seen from space and also block out space. How can a place like this exist? Well, how can such horrible memories exist alongside such great ones? The answer is not so clear. In this small town, a group of boys share fond memories. Now, of course, they are men, and have long forgotten the freedom of their childhood, because as we age, we feel that we become more free. And this could be the case for some, those who kept in mind the right memories. But for many others, we become victim to our bills, to our job, and to things that we really don't have any interest in. A young boy and his friends burst out the school's doors with an excitement most of us have not felt since that day. The last day of school. It's unlike any other, and it brings out the deepest feelings that we can feel inside of us. A long year of discipline has worn on our young minds, our malleable minds, and the second the weight of such discipline is lifted, their freedom springs back to its original place, and they run rampant along the town streets. The young men follow each other closely, running like the wind to get home. Specifically, Billy's home. Billy was the ringleader, so to speak, and was always concocting great plans to carry out for he and his friends. With him was Frankie, Stephen, and Ethan. They were an inseparable group. Billy was the tallest, but by no means the strongest. That was Frankie. Frankie was a short, buzzed-head ginger whose parents, believe it or not, were old-school Italian mobsters. Nobody ever knew if they were truly mobsters or not, but they looked and acted the part. So to the children, they may as well have been Joe Gallo and company. Billy was the son of a hard-nosed construction worker and a stay-at-home mom whose affection was never dwindling. Stephen and Ethan were twins, and Billy and Frankie often couldn't tell the two apart. That didn't matter, though, as the twins were inseparable at the hip and ill-mannered. They knew what each other was thinking and were aware of the difficulty in differentiating themselves. However, They claimed they looked wildly different from each other and often poked fun at the boys for not knowing the difference. Despite these differences and difficult similarities, the group cracked on like none other and played all hours of the night, forming memories that would last all of time. Unfortunately, though, it is neither a great memory nor is it a fantastic fantasy of a day once had. It is one of misery and despair. It is one that these boys would soon forget, for they could not bear to live with its meaning. And as a result, they may not be ready to bear the life they'll lead having forgotten. Billy and the twins all reached their destination together, with Frankie lagging behind due to his stocky frame. He was built like the great Hambino, and would one day make for a powerful linebacker, but as a young cherub, he was chunky and slow. Frankie joined the group mid-conversation, something about a game, one they've never played before, and as Billy explained, the sound of cellophane ripping open interrupted him as Frankie ripped open a Butterfinger. None of the boys said a word, but snickered wildly before turning back to the conversation. Billy was introducing the new game he'd heard about, called Blindfolded Tag.
"It's exactly like what it sounds like,"
exclaimed Billy. Most times when Billy dropped a new idea or a new activity for the boys to enjoy together, it was met with excitement. But none of the boys said a word, as they simultaneously looked to the ground and kicked at rocks. After what felt like hours to the boys, Billy finally convinced them to join in on his game and entertain the idea of blindfolded tag. The rules were simple. The seeker counts like any other game of tag, while the hiders go and hide. But once the count is up, the seeker must put on their blindfold and stumble around the house like a mummy, searching for their friends. Oftentimes, their friends, the hiders, they barely even hide, opting to find spots in which they can quickly jump out from to scare their friend to death. The boys played this game for the first time, and they became addicted to the thrill. They'd play, and they'd mess with each other the whole way. It was often that the blindfolded seeker would be right in front of one of the hidees, and being that the boys were as close as could be, this usually resulted in the hidee tickling the neck of the seeker and whispering something creepy in their ear. The fun did not come from winning or losing, but from messing with each other. Mostly they would play in Billy's house, because it was the largest, and they'd play until the house was silent in slumber. They'd have to be extra careful at these hours, especially so as not to wake Billy's father. Many nights ended in a fisted rage coming directly from his father, who woke up to the shrill shriek that came from a prepubescent boy. Each time, it would be wrapped up by the hulking footsteps of Billy's dad returning upstairs as he cursed under his breath. A popular saying was repeated by the boys as a result, one that's repeated to this day. As his dad would travel back up to bed, the boys would often hear him mumbling to himself, "Don't get married, don't have kids. Don't get married, don't have kids. Why didn't I listen?" And he would repeat that over and over. The boys loved the game of blindfolded tag so much that they almost understood the anger that Billy's father had. Like with all young boys, with experience comes confidence. The more they do something, the more they believe they can do it, and they can do it to the max. Whether it's skating, gaming, or any kind of sport, give them enough time with it, and they'll take it overboard. These boys were no different, because after some time, late into the hot summer months, the boys invited more friends and upped the ante. It was the last week of summer. The boys had transitioned to play the game outside on the cow farm next to Billy's house. The farmer who tended the field was too old and too tiresome to care that young children were playing dangerous games on his property. And despite the warning signs pinned to posts around the field, the boys ventured in each day and played until dark. But as each day shortened with the coming solstice, the eager young men would come closer and closer to finishing the game in complete darkness. There were no street lamps in this town, only the pale light of a silver moon. This night in particular, Frankie's older brother Robbie tagged along. He was 17, and to 11-year-old boys, that was a responsible adult. Robbie felt the same way, until that night. The boys started an hour late that day, rushing on their bikes to the farm down the road so they could start. They arrived and got to it. Billy was it first, and the boys all dispersed to the field. This field was large and spanned a great distance. It was enclosed at all ends, apart from the gate at the front. 10-foot piles of brush the farmer had placed over the years laid along the outskirts just beyond the forest. Some of the lumber was older than the boys' fathers. It sprawled out over 4 acres, with few trees, until the tree line. As the boys played, the hours evaporated under the hot sun. Without knowing or caring, the bright afternoon sun retired for that night, switching places with a glowing moon. The stars were out on that clear night, and the Milky Way provided some extra light. Despite the lack of street lamps, certain nights provided enough light that you could see just fine. The sky was bright with natural light bestowed by the great lunar gods. But where there are gods, demons always lurk, and all demons answer to the devil. Billy hid under a pile of matted moss that had been propped up by the farmer's backhoe. It was unclear why, but Billy assumed it was just part of farming. Under the moss was a small ditch just small enough for 2 young boys to fit. Billy, on his own, had plenty of room. Frankie, the seeker this round, was blindfolded and stumbling through the dimly lit field, precariously stepping over known dung piles, sometimes stepping in the freshly laid heaps of crap. He alerted the hiders that this was the last game, as dark had come upon them. It was moments like these that made the game so fun. The camaraderie of gamemanship is one thing, but the seclusion found in being alone at night under the stars, hiding from an eager friend, was unmatched and oddly peaceful. From above, Billy could hear the patter of running footsteps, too light to be a steer, but too heavy to be the twins. It must be Robbie. The footsteps came, and they went fading into the night. Billy raised his head out of the ditch to catch the soles of Robbie's feet disappearing into the brush pile surrounding the farm. As Billy crouched back into his hiding spot, he stared up at the stars, the Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, and all of the other constellations our ancestors prayed to and built monuments for, out of massive stones. They were there that night, keeping him company. Another sound breaks his relaxation. It was the sound of stumbling feet coming his way, heavy breathing. Billy moved not an inch. He stayed exactly where he laid, not moving a muscle. The footsteps were almost drunken. Frankie must be tired, Billy thought, as he waited in anticipation of fat old Frankie falling flat on his face. His focus was broken by a strange happening. The ground rumbled faintly for just a moment, and in that moment the forest came alive, and a cacophony of katydids filled the silence triumphantly. No longer could Frankie's awkward footsteps be heard. No longer could anything but the chatter of loud-mouthed bugs be heard. Now Billy was afraid. On a night like this, no senses are lost as the moon provides enough light for the eyes and brain to adjust. But now Billy lays in a dirt hole, deaf and blind. As the thought of regret in his hiding place crossed his developing mind, he slowly began inching up to peek across the field. Unknown to him at the time, he would soon be found. Suddenly, the loose dirt in Billy's hole shifted. Billy didn't move an inch and knew that something had moved that dirt. There was little light lingering within the hole, but it was nearly pitch black. There wasn't enough room for Billy to stretch out his arms all the way. Billy's eyes shot up, and standing there with a panicked look was a blindfolded Frankie. Billy shouted over the sound of the chittering insects to alert his presence, and more importantly, the hole's presence. Frankie didn't move. He either didn't hear him, or he was fucking with him. Billy thought to himself for a second and yelled out again with an emphatic cuss. Then, Frankie fell forward into the hole limp, flat onto Billy. Squashed under the weight of his fat friend, Billy screamed bloody murder, a scream that no bug could block out, and one that would certainly alert the others. but who else is playing the game with them? Moments later, the twins had appeared at the hole and were lifting Frankie's round body out of it by his feet. As they did, Billy hopped out crying, covered in dirt. He wonders, is he dead? As they wondered what to do, a loud fart blurts from Frankie's still body. Then, a wild smirk appears on his face, and he begins to laugh wildly.
3 and 1. Ha ha, I got you.
Yelled the hysterical Frankie. As Frankie rolled around, soaking in the moment, the boys standing before him let out slight chuckles. Billy helped Frankie up through chuckles and tears. It's been some time since the boys were scared like that. Frankie came to his feet with an athletic hop. Billy was too quick to comment that Frankie had never moved that quick and must still be reeling from that kick you got out of us. The twins broke up the not-so-serious face-off that was now occurring before the hole, avoiding it at all costs. Dirt fell into the hole while Billy and Frankie play-fought, giggling their asses off. The twins had given up getting between Frankie and anything. They felt that was a wise decision. Suddenly, the boys' attention was ripped to the woods.
You pussy still found me.
At a point where the thick dead brush was the highest, stood a tall, dark figure. It sounded like Robbie, but the boys were unsure. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. It was a moment akin to a loud bang coming from the kitchen as you lay in bed in the black of night. Not a muscle was moved. The dark shadow of the person or thing was motionless, but after a few seconds of silence, the figure hopped down the steep pile of brush as if it were steps at school. The boys looked back and forth at one another, exchanging looks of horror, and stayed dead silent. It was only seconds later that all 4 of the boys had leaped into the hole behind them. They were there shoulder to shoulder, with just enough room to move their arms freely a little bit. They watched as the figure approached them. It moved quickly, covering much ground with each step. But much like the sounds of Frankie's feet from earlier, the gait of whoever this was seemed drunken. As they sat frozen in fear, Frankie looks down and grasps in between his eyes. He winces and looks over at the boys, smirking lightly. He hops out of the hole, not saying a word. The boys in the hole hopped out after Frankie, protesting as quietly as possible. Frankie ignored it all. Frankie yells out to who he thinks is his brother, cursing him, and as he finishes, he turns to the boys. His large smirk fades away. It turns into a look of pure confusion and terror. Standing behind Billy and the twins was Robbie. Robbie asked with as much confusion and terror in his eyes as Frankie had.
Who the fuck is that?
Blurts out Frankie. The group began sprinting. No words were spoken. If the kids at school saw how fast Frankie ran that night, they surely wouldn't believe it, because he was keeping pace with Robbie, who had 6 years and 8 inches on him. But fear will do that to you. They ran as fast as their muscles would allow, for as long as their muscles would allow. As they ran, the sound of the katydids' chatter bled back into their ears. It was so loud that there wasn't a noise in the atmosphere at this point other than it. It was coming from within their own heads. At least, that's what it felt like. As they ran, Billy looked back just once. The Shadow Man was just feet away, and he was still as black as night, even under the silver moon's light. As Billy looked, even in that split second, the Shadow Man opened a gaping mouth that glowed with a bright white glow. Thick white smog poured out of his mouth, and it plumed back into the backdraft behind him like a human train. And as this occurred, much like a trick in Photoshop, he split into 4. Billy kept running with his friends, all of whom were screaming. As they turned onto their street, Robbie and Frankie beelined to their home, the twins to theirs, leaving Billy to himself. In the fear of unknowing, his friends didn't have the presence of mind to simply grab his arm and drag him into their own house. The fear was just too much, and it enveloped each of their minds. Fear can also do that to you. Speaking of fear, Billy was now alone on his road, and would have to run the whole road and up the long driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac. As each of them entered their homes, the fear expressed was enough for the parents of each boy to forgive their lateness immediately. Sometimes parents can see that no further reprimanding or admonishing will do any good. Sometimes they see they've raised their young well enough for their young to know themselves when they've gone too far, when they've ventured too deep into the woods. Their mothers held them, and their fathers loaded weapons that hadn't been cleaned in a decade. All the while, gargantuan shadows lay over their homes. The shadows of a man who, for whatever reason, was hanging around the cow farm late that night. Frankie's father paced the kitchen, wielding a dusty double-barreled shotgun loaded with 2 bullets of buckshot. As he paced, he shouted,
No fucking birdshot for you, motherfucker. I'll blow your fucking head off.
Robbie was shut away in his room, feverishly grinding weed up in a roster-colored grinder. Frankie sobbed in his mother's arms, much like the twins. And to this day, Billy's parents wait for their son to come home. So when I speak of which things you should and should not remember, well, remember this. Wherever there are angels, gods, and the signs of heaven, around the corner be demons and the devil himself.